Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm thrilled to see all of you and see all the places you're coming here from. Welcome, friends. Welcome to Using Our Power, Nonviolence, and Non-Cooperation in History and Today. This is a webinar jointly sponsored by Pace Bene, Campaign Nonviolence, and Franciscan Action Network. My name is Michelle Dunn. I'm Executive Director of Franciscan Action Network, FAN, and also I'm a board member of Pace Bene. I'm thrilled to be with you today. And during this hour-long webinar, we've gathered to learn more about a particular aspect of nonviolence. Gandhi called it the constructive program, and others sometimes refer to it as constructive non-cooperation. I was looking as I was preparing for our program, I was reviewing the 198 methods of nonviolent action by the nonviolence scholar Gene Sharp, and I noticed that half of them are forms of social, economic, or political non-cooperation. And yet it seems to me that many of us are not as familiar with non-cooperation as we are with other forms of nonviolent action, such as protest. So we are so blessed to have with us today three of the leading scholars of nonviolence in the United States here to educate us. And they are Maria Stephan of the Horizons Project, Rivera Sun of Pace Bene, and Ken Budigan, also of Pace Bene. All of them have been my teachers in nonviolence. And I really hope you're going to enjoy learning from them as much as I have. I've asked Ken to start us off with an opening prayer and a few words about nonviolence and non-cooperation in the lives of St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi to ground us. After that, I'm going to conduct a discussion with Maria and Rivera and Ken, and then you're going to have an opportunity to ask all three of them questions. Now, when I introduce Ken in a moment, we're going to turn off the chat function so it doesn't distract us during the program. But the Q&A function, which I hope you can find, is probably near the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the program on the Q&A, using the Q&A function on your screen. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, I'll bring forward your questions. So that's going to be your way. You can submit those questions at any time. They'll be collected there, and then we'll look at them when we get to the Q&A portion. So I'm happy now to introduce Dr. Ken Budigan, Chief Strategist at Pace Bene. He's a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, a co-founder of the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence in Rome. He is widely published in peace and nonviolence studies and has led many pilgrimages to Assisi. And I've been blessed to be on pilgrimage with him in Assisi. And in these pilgrimages, he really brings out the amazing lessons in peace and nonviolence taught by St. Francis and St. Clare. So Ken, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you all for being part of this important event. As we begin, let's join in a moment of silence as we come together to reflect on this profound crisis in the life of this nation and this world. We invite you to center according to your own beliefs, whether faith-based or simply taking a moment to breathe deeply. Let's take a moment of silence. Thank you. We've assembled to explore how we can non-violently non-cooperate with the tsunami of suffering being unleashed by the new administration. What can embolden us to confront the carnage of exclusion, separation, and destruction? What can empower us to foster a more just, diverse, equitable, and inclusive society? Since our gathering is sponsored by two organizations that have deep connections to Francis and Clare of Assisi, Francis, a saint renowned for peacemaking who lived in the 13th century, let's open with the words of Francis himself for a moment of centering. This is what Francis wrote. When we see or hear evil spoken or done, or God blasphemed, let us speak well and do well and praise God who is blessed forever. Amen. St. Francis is here echoing the biblical idea of overcoming evil with good. The best way to defeat evil, he's saying, is not with evil in return, but by speaking and doing well. In short, by responding with the spirit of goodness and what today we call nonviolence. But when we examine how Francis actually did this, we come to see that this meant what today we call non-cooperation, the refusal to cooperate with the conditions or even systems that create evil. I'd like to share three brief examples of this from the life of St. Francis. We see this when Francis non-cooperates non-violently with a system that sees three robbers as irredeemable and instead breaks the rules of his society by showering mercy on them. We see this when Francis non-cooperates with his own brothers who have rejected a blaspheming person with Hansen's disease, which we often call leprosy. Francis abandons the systemic script of his time, which would be to utterly condemn the blasphemer, and instead sees with the eyes of recognition the violence that has been inflicted by the culture at that time on this tortured fellow, and in the end says simply, I will do whatever you want. But perhaps the most apt example for today's discussion is that he required his followers to not bear arms. To be a Franciscan meant to not carry weapons, which was a profound case of nonviolent non-cooperation with a society where especially men were expected to be conscripted into the almost ceaseless wars of that time. As one historian has written, too often in the 13th century Italian city, doing the restrained or peaceful thing would have required the renunciation of self-identity. Francis was asking those who followed him to renounce the self-identity of warrior. Over time, this had far-reaching consequences. As former Minister General of the Franciscans, Herman Chaluk, noted, he forbade all of his followers to carry weapons. As a result, it became increasingly difficult for some feudal lords to muster an army together, as there were so many secular Franciscans who refused to carry arms. This simple demand by Francis helped to collapse the feudal system in Europe. Francis himself refused to carry weapons when he sought to end the Fifth Crusade by rejecting the Christian war-making and crossing into the war zone in Egypt, unarmed to engage non-violently with the Sultan Malik al-Kamil. Francis's non-violent non-cooperation of systems of violence and war is rooted in his experience of battle in 1202 as a young person, and then being held as a prisoner of war for a year, and the spiritual journey he undertook to seek healing from this trauma, a journey that led to an encounter with the cross at San Damiano, which revealed the horror of violence and the call to peace, which, practically speaking, meant non-violently, non-cooperating with everything that stands in the way of that peace. Francis of Assisi discovered that he was called to a non-violent non-cooperation with his own society that excluded, condemned, and marginalized, a society that institutionalized us versus them in so many ways, including by building and maintaining a culture of war and violence. We also saw this in the experience of St. Clare of Assisi, who carried on a protracted nonviolent non-cooperation campaign with the church itself, so that she could have the order, the first written by a woman for her religious community, accepted, which was finally accepted one day before her death. So there are, of course, many others in history and in our own time calling us to overcome evil with good, which includes non-violently, non-cooperating with that evil so that good can prevail. So to hear what that can mean in our own day, we turn again to Michelle, who is facilitating today's panel.
Thank you so much, Ken. We'll bring Ken back in a moment to be part of the panel when we have shortly before the question and answer. But right now, I would like to introduce Maria Stefan. Maria is currently chief organizer at the Horizons Project. She is the author of half a dozen books, including the co-author of with Erica Chenoweth, the seminal work, Why Civil Resistance Works. Maria's also done a lot of hands-on peace-building work at the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Institute of Peace, among other places. So welcome, Maria. And you know, Maria, this webinar grew out of a conversation that you and I had in January, where you were emphasizing the importance and the efficacy of non-cooperation actions as opposed to protest or other kinds of nonviolent actions in a situation like the one we have in the US right now, in which many Americans are concerned and even alarmed at the actions of the new US administration. So would you start us off by saying a few words, Maria, about how you see the current situation in the US and give us the basics? Why nonviolent action and certain kinds of, as opposed to violent actions, and certain kinds of nonviolence are more effective than others when citizens want to change what their government is doing?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for hosting the webinar. Thanks to Fan, to Pache Bene. It's such a timely moment to have a conversation about non-cooperation, I feel, in the US. And you were recalling when we last met in January, and the context for that, it was a retreat of faith leaders and leaders of faith networks. And this was happening right after the inauguration. And it was a profound moment with this group where we were reflecting upon, Bishop Miriam Buddy, who in that moment during the inaugural prayer service chose, going against maybe what was expected, to speak truth to power, and to call on the president to have mercy on those who have fear in this moment, those immigrants, members of the LGBTQ community, others. And so, I think it's so important to have a conversation about the strategic collective action components of non-cooperation now at a time when, just to put a finer point on it, I think we're facing a very serious authoritarian threat to the country. And not only in this country, folks may be aware that around the world, we're seeing kind of a rise of authoritarianism. Freedom House has documented something like 19 consecutive years of rising autocracy and declining freedom scores. And another democracy group, the Varieties of Democracy, VDEM, has found that there's now more closed autocracies than liberal democracies for the first time in about 20 years. And so this is definitely a global trend. And then just based on what's been happening in the United States, recently the Polity Project downgraded the United States actually to a non-democracy status. And there's some dispute about the classification, but the bottom line is that we are not in normal times now. We have an administration that's backed by tech billionaires, enabled by a political party that has been taken over by an authoritarian faction that is swiftly implementing the authoritarian playbook. And the goal is to consolidate power and control. So what does that mean? That means weaponizing government agencies to punish political opponents. It means consolidating power in the executive and undermining checks and balances, like ignoring court orders. It means attacking independent civil society, scapegoating minorities, encouraging or fomenting political violence. So it's kind of this fear-based divide and rule that's been used by autocrats from across the political spectrum around the world. And I should say, in my, work and research and working with activists and movements around the world, I've worked with movements that have challenged left-wing dictatorships and far-right authoritarian regimes. And so the problem in my distaste is for autocracy and authoritarianism in general. So, and on a personal note, it's been difficult to see the DOJ and FBI agents enter my former employer, the United States Institute of Peace, actually illegally. And, seeing the dismissal of the staff, the attempted firing of the president, and even the peace sign. Some of you who have entered the USIP building, the peace sign at the reception was removed from the building. So it's like a visceral seeing it kind of play out in our daily lives. And I think folks on this call all have your personal experiences of what this moment is bringing to you and to your communities. But the good news in this moment, I think, is that, autocrats often are weaker than they appear, and we are stronger than we think. And even autocrats that seem really powerful are typically vulnerable to strategic, organized, nonviolent action. Because the Achilles heel of autocrats is that they ultimately rely on the consent and cooperation of ordinary people from key institutions in society. So these are faith communities, businesses, unions, professional associations, police, veterans, military groups. And when these groups withdraw their consent and cooperation, they non-cooperate, this can result in, the autocrat losing power entirely. So if Rosie, you can put up the slides really quickly, just to say, so Michelle had mentioned my research with Erica Chenoweth and others on on the history and the practice of civil resistance around the world. And, and so Erica and I looked at campaigns challenging autocracy and authoritarian regimes globally. And, to cut a long story short, we found that the most successful pro-democracy movements were those that featured broad-based coalitions and movements. So that involved diverse participation from across society, all different sectors and groups, and that they were able to innovate tactically. So meaning they were able to use symbolic tactics and protests and symbols, and were able to escalate and use non-cooperation tactics. So the economic boycotts, the strikes, the civil disobedience, walkouts. So being able to alternate different tactics and being able to disperse tactics is critically important to being able to apply pressure and to remove the sources of power that autocrats and regimes need to maintain power. So we also found that when you start to see shifts in loyalties of key pillars of support, so when faith leaders start doing, not doing what they're expected to, when businesses withdraw consent and support, when, unions, professionals. So when you start to see these shifts, that's usually an indicator that movements are succeeding. And then, the ability to maintain nonviolent discipline in the face of repression. So that's like some of the general findings and why this topic of non-cooperation and like applied social, economic, political pressure is so important. Jen, the next slide, just to say, because I'll go quickly through these like data, just to give a sense of our moment. So, just to say that when democracies start to backslide, it's often very difficult to reverse. So I wanted to share some of the recent data on democratic backsliding around the world. And you'll see in these 96 episodes of democratic backsliding from 1900 to 2019, nearly 68% broke down into authoritarian rule, and about 13% of the cases were inconclusive. But the good news, and over to the next slide, is that, there have been reversals. About 46% of the cases of democratic breakdown were able to turn it around and reverse it, which is a good sign, and 54% over the last 30 years. And the really important point, if you go to the next slide, is that civil resistance, which includes organized non-cooperation, played a critical role in these democratic reversals. So you'll see that the probability of stopping democratic backsliding was quite low, about 75% without a civil resistance movement, and about 51% with a civil resistance movement. So critically important is like being able to mount a successful strategic civil resistance campaign. So you can pull down the slides, Rosie, thank you. And so just to say, so where this Rivera is going to be offering plenty of examples of non-cooperation, how it works, examples from history and more in the more contemporary period. And, Ken, I so appreciated your examples of St. Francis, Jesus, St. Clair. And, there are many kind of famous historical examples as well from more recent history. You think of Socrates, for example, who refused to obey ancient Greek laws about teaching youth. He was accused of corrupting the youth, and then he willingly accepted the court ruling that condemned him to death. So that's a famous individual example. Henry David Thoreau, of course, who wrote on civil disobedience after spending a night in jail for refusing to pay a poll tax, which he saw as supporting slavery and the Mexican-American War. But power is expressed through organization and collective action. So, however, one of the most early documented cases of non-cooperation comes from the ancient Greek play Lysistrata. Some of you may be familiar, when the women withheld sex from their lovers and partners in order to end the Peloponnesian War. And then there's a more modern application of this strategy. Some of you may know the case of the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. So this was a movement led by Muslim and Christian women in Liberia who came together in an attempt to end the Civil War. And so they organized a sex strike, refused withheld sex from their husbands. They had a sit-in where the negotiations were happening between the government and rebels. So all kind of classic campaigns. And then more recently, the South Africa anti-apartheid struggle, a key case where consumer boycotts led by the United Democratic Front imposed significant costs on white-owned businesses, which was key to pressuring de Klerk and the South African government to negotiate with the ANC. So a very effective applied economic pressure. I most recently was in Montgomery. I spent the last week in Montgomery, Alabama. So when you think about the US civil rights movement, which I would consider to be our greatest anti-authoritarian pro-democracy movement in our history, the campaigns of organized non-cooperation, the Montgomery bus boycotts, which successfully desegregated the bus system, the lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, all were intentional, organized non-cooperation that played a seminal role in dismantling racial apartheid in the South. And I think, and again, Rivera, I'll be handing it over to her shortly to offer some more examples, but you think as well about Poland. So I have Polish ancestry. And, speaking of the civil rights movement, the MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, which for me is the classic treatise on why nonviolence and non-cooperation is essential to bring about change in society and conflict transformation. So that letter inspired Lech Walesa of the Polish Solidarity Movement, who referred to it as a source of inspiration for the Gdańsk shipyard strike in 1980 that imposed significant economic costs on the communist dictatorship that led to an independent trade union and ultimately to a democratic transition. So there's always learning, and people cite other cases from around the world and from history. And then just a couple of more recent ones. You all may have seen last year, at the end of last year in South Korea, the president attempted to launch a coup and there was martial law declared. So did you all see the mass mobilization of people who came out, who formed a barricade so that the members of parliament could return to the parliament to vote? The trade unions and labor unions threatened a general strike if martial law was not lifted. So these are just like a few examples from the panoply of like mass non-cooperation around the world. And she's going to take us to the present, but I think important moments from Trump 1.0 administration. You all recall kind of the opening salvo was when the Muslim ban was invoked. People rushed to the airports. They had sit-ins. They provided pro bono legal support. There was like sustained non-cooperation with that order, with that law that reversed it. And all of the sanctuary actions targeting undocumented, targeting immigrants to protect them from illegal roundups. So there's this long, powerful history in this country and around the world of people engaging in what I would call collective stubbornness or collective defiance to be able to say no to an unjust system in order that we can say yes to something that's fair, just, and moral. So I will now turn things back over to Michelle, who's going to introduce Rivera.
Maria, thank you so much. I have just a very quick follow-up question. So you mentioned diverse participation in nonviolent actions, non-cooperation actions. And I know you're thinking of like different social groups, professional groups, et cetera. But what about diverse participation politically? Because I think you're speaking mainly about a situation in which people are very, very broadly opposing a government. But what, for example, about in the United States, about people maybe who support President Trump, who voted for President Trump, but who might not like some of the things the administration is doing right now? Do you see that happening, where there could be cooperation on opposition to specific steps, specific measures that the administration is taking?
Sure. And just to say, just about a month ago, I was with a convening of pro-democracy conservatives in DC, the Principles First group, where they were talking about like how people are organizing kind of at the grassroots level, how they are pushing back. And, the research does indicate that successful pro-democracy movements need the support of the left, of the center right. So it's truly a broad, diverse front that is critical. And I think like you're already seeing signs in like town hall meetings you've seen in conservative Republican districts in response to the federal funding freezes, the cuts to the Veterans Administration, to Medicaid, the firing of federal workers, many of whom are outside of the DC area. So this is having like profound ripple effects, and people are speaking out. They're angry about what's happening. Some of the deportation policies has prompted more conservative leaning churches, Catholic churches and others, to speak out, to file lawsuits on the protected sites. And so you definitely see, there's also a lot of anticipatory obedience, unfortunately. So corporations that are going along and others out of fear, out of perceived self-interest. But I think those voices that are speaking out at the grassroots level, in communities, in the faith community, the legal community, because now law firms are coming under attack. And so you're seeing like conservative lawyers, some of whom like resigned out of protest, the Daniel Sassoons and others. So you see these kind of cracks in people that are not willing to go along with what this administration has to offer.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. We'll bring you back in a moment when we get to Q&A. But right now I want to introduce Rivera's son. Rivera is Advancing Nonviolence Coordinator for Pace Bene. She's an experienced trainer in nonviolence, editor of Nonviolence News, and the award-winning author of 9 novels. So, Rivera, I'm hearing a lot more lately about non-cooperation boycotts, consumer boycotts, and other kinds of non-cooperation actions. But could you please give us the big picture about how these kind of non-cooperation actions have been used in the past, particularly in the United States, and how you see them being used now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for convening this really important discussion. I have my illustration of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers strike hanging over my shoulder today, just to remind us of the power of removing our consent through as workers, through going on strike with our labor, as shoppers, by not buying certain products, as allied groups, in their case, the dock workers not loading the ships full of grapes. The more ways that we can find as a society to withdraw our cooperation, our consent, and our time and money and support in objection to the abuses that we see, the stronger we will be. This is a strong shift. Here in the United States, we have had a right to protest for a long time, and it's been held very sacred. It's under attack, and it has always been under attack from marginalized groups. But the shift to add non-cooperation to what we're doing is one of the most important strategic moves we can make right now. When we look at nonviolent action, there are over 300 different methods of nonviolent action, and we can look at them in a lot of different ways, but one way is to look at 3 different broad categories: acts of protest and persuasion, acts of non-cooperation, and acts of intervention. Protest and persuasion is very familiar to us. These are the marches, rallies, banners, signs, speeches that we use a lot in our society. Acts of intervention, by contrast, are when we physically get in the way of injustice. These are very powerful actions. They're also often very high-risk actions. Non-cooperation is when we find ways to remove our support. So boycotts, walkouts, call-in sicks, reluctant or slow compliance, refusal to obey, strikes, withdrawing our resources. A definition of non-cooperation could be deliberate restriction, discontinuance, or withholding of expected behavior or cooperation with a disapproved person, activity, institution, or government. So this is very broad. There's a lot of ways for us to apply it. And let's look at a few historic examples to kind of illuminate this. Maria has given you so many, but there's a few that we absolutely must mention, starting with our own history. So before we get to that, Maria mentioned those pillars of support. The reason non-cooperation is so effective is because when we take away the resources that autocrats require, they cannot operate, they cannot function, they cannot carry out their orders. If nobody cooperates with them, even the worst dictator is just a little guy in a room throwing a temper tantrum. It's the moment that someone takes that tirade and says, yeah, I'll go dig a ditch and kill people and put them in it, that tyrant has power. So when we remove our support, they topple from power. But even more powerfully, when we remove those pillars of support and we put those resources into the alternative, we build the solution that we want by depriving the problem of the resources that it needs. All right, now let's get back to the American Revolution, because we're often told that this is how we won our independence. The Minutemen grabbed their muskets and they fought the Revolutionary War. Well, by the time we got to the war, we were already functionally independent. And that was won by something more like this: 10 years of robust non-cooperation strategies against the British Empire. These are the best boycotts ever in recorded history, and most Americans have no idea about them. We didn't call them boycotts because the word had not been invented yet. It wouldn't be invented for another 100 years. We called them non-importation acts, and we refused to import British goods with 90 to 98% participation rates. These are some of the highest in the world. We denied the British Empire, out of 14 million pounds total, 13 million of that income revenue. In addition, We non-cooperated with their tax laws. We non-cooperated with the Stamp Act. We non-cooperated with the laws of curfew that they tried to implement. By the time we get to 1776, these campaigns were so robust that we had closed their courts, we weren't paying taxes, we refused to import their products, we had set up our own government, we were spying on them and obstructing their every move, we were in open defiance of their governors and boycotting their collaborators. Basically, the British couldn't govern us. This is effective nonviolent non-cooperation. And it won our functional independence. So by the time the Declaration of Independence was issued, it was a de facto statement of fact. And the War of Revolution was actually a war of reclamation. Think about that. So boycott, we didn't call them boycotts because it wouldn't be invented till the 1880s in Ireland during the land wars when the British, same British Empire, was trying to kick out the Irish tenants. What they did was particularly against Captain Charles Boycott, who was throwing widows off of their farms, kicking out the elders, starving children, burning down houses so the tenants couldn't live in them anymore. They launched a social ostracization campaign of boycott. And they wouldn't talk to him, they wouldn't serve him food, they wouldn't work in his house, they wouldn't pay his rents, they wouldn't tell him where so-and-so went. Nobody would do anything with Charles Boycott. This caught on in other places. So people said, hey, let's do to our landlord what they did to Boycott. Let's boycott him. This got picked up by the newspapers and within a matter of weeks was being reported on as far away as the US of A. So flash forward another 70 years or so, and we have Gandhi in India fighting the same British Empire, the same autocratic authoritarian state, wherein the people rising up against them had very few rights or liberties or privileges and very few recourses through the traditional form of government. Gandhi, of course, like the American colonists who spun their own cloth and held spin-ins and refused to buy British cloth, did the same thing. He deprived the British of their import revenue by saying, we're not going to wear your clothes anymore. He defied them their authority and their revenue on salt by organizing the salt campaign and doing civil disobedience to those laws, saying, we no longer respect your laws. They don't have any authority over us. You know what? The British didn't like that. They cracked down, they arrested a bunch of people, they put in a curfew law. But every time the British tried to stop the SALT campaign by putting in another law, banning gatherings, banning putting in curfews, the word from the Indian movement was defy that one, defy that restriction, go out and disobey it, until the jails were so full they couldn't arrest any more people, and the British had no ability to rule over the Indians anymore. Non-cooperation has also been extremely effective, and people often ask this question, will it work against the Nazis, basically? The answer actually is yes, and we have a lot of examples of this from World War II. Of course, there was a whole full-scale war happening. I'm not saying it isn't. But the resistance movements used a lot of robust non-cooperation tactics to extremely good effect in limited examples. In Denmark, they rescued 6,800 Jews from right under the nose of the occupying Nazi government, getting them to safety. In Norway, 20,000 teachers refused to implement a Nazi curriculum into the schools, even when threatened with being rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. They never actually got to implement that curriculum. This is something we should pay attention to in the United States today, by the way. The Dutch bankers channeled money through back channels to fund all the resistance movements, including a strike fund of railway workers that brought the munitions and supply shipments to a grinding halt at a pivotal moment in the war effort. So the Germans could not get the supplies that they needed. These tactics were popularized through sabotage and resistance manuals. They were a whole segment of resistance, and this declassified manual is now circulating widely today. This included things like working really slowly, or bogging down meetings by making long speeches, or off-topic comments, haggling over minute details so they never could get through the agenda of anything. Even doing things like calling the offices to bog down their phone systems, which is a tactic that we are seeing people use digitally with emails today in resistance. This kind of thing was so effective in Denmark that even though the Nazis had wanted to use the Denmark shipyards to build warships for them, the Danish shipyard workers would literally screw in bolts as slowly as possible, and as soon as the Nazis were not looking, they would unscrew the bolts. This was so effective that after years of occupation, by the end of the war, the Danish shipyard workers had not built a single warship for the Nazis. This is an incredible toolbox. Let's talk about how we see this in action today. First of all, resistance is happening everywhere. I rounded up 135 examples of different efforts throughout the first 50 days of this new administration alone. We see things like Alt National Park Service, which actually got started in the first Trump administration, setting up parallel and alternative social media accounts, and especially this time around, really using them to give a blow-by-blow, fact-based information to people about what is going on. We see an exodus of people leaving Twitter because of Musk doing what looked like a Nazi salute and his actions with Doge, and going over to Blue Sky, non-cooperating with social platforms. Of course, we see the Tesla takedown, which is trying to get people to not buy Tesla cars, to dump their stock, in opposition to Musk's behaviors and gutting of public services. This has been an extremely effective campaign. There have been incidents of sabotage and arson that are not being organized by this movement. And I think it's important to name that distinction and to recognize that this kind of action can often undermine the success of a movement. So we got to watch what's happening really carefully. They have dropped Tesla's sales up to 90% in certain countries and tanked the stock prices lately. We also saw a day of national economic blackout, which was surprisingly successful. They targeted Target, which reversed its stance on DEI policies and got rid of them. So Target was one of those targets. It did drop their website traffic. There is now a longer boycott of Target to try to get really specific demands achieved. This is being organized by Black leadership and wanting to build on this campaign that Target is really struggling financially right now, to put the pressure on them to make good their promises that they made, to do things like fund the Black business community, support Black banks, restore DEI policies, and several other things. So boycotts take organization, and this is really important to know. We hear a lot of calls right now for boycott this, boycott that, don't shop anywhere. To be effective, here's a list of things you need that comes from a new group called Boycott Central, or project rather, that came out of Choose Democracy. Boycotts need a target. Who is supposed to change their behavior? They need a demand so that the target knows what they have to do to get the boycott to stop. You need boycotters, not just people who are upset and say, oh, I won't shop at Target. I never really did anyway. But the people who do shop at Target to stop shopping there. You're going to need a leadership committee so that they can actually negotiate to succeed in this, and a way to communicate with the boycotters, which this seems like a no-brainer, but is actually one of our challenges right now, that people are putting out the word about boycotts on social media, but it's hit or miss. You won't necessarily see their next update from the boycott organizers. So get on email lists. It is the best way to stay connected and to really be part of a long-term effective campaign. Boycott Central is keeping a list of all of this, making sure that you can track which ones actually are well designed to be effective. So do your research, join in the ones that are most effective. And if you're organizing something, try to get all these little checks lined up so you can be as effective as possible. On top of that, here's just a few more takeaways that you can think about how to non-cooperate with the myriad abuses and injustices we're facing today. First of all, refuse to comply. Don't go along with injustice and abuse. If they want to erase you, for example, this administration is literally erasing the words trans, LGBTQ, women, climate, Black, from all government many government websites. The more they try to erase us, the more we should use every inch of public space to be visible, to be loud, to be proud, so that we are undeniable and unignorable. So refuse to comply, deny them their goals. This happened in Utah when lawmakers banned the pride flag, so they unfurled a 200-foot flag on the steps of the state capitol. This kind of defiance can be a lot of fun, and it also helps to defend our right to protest and assembly by using it. The other thing, and Maria mentioned this, is do not obey in advance. Never comply with an unjust order ahead of schedule. Always put up at least one level of resistance so that the burden of compliance is put on the administrator or put on those who are trying to cause harm. Make them expend the effort to make you comply. Don't just comply because you're afraid of what they might do. Make them make good on their promises or back down. This takes courage and coordination. So that's the third point. If you are not in a position to non-comply with an unjust order, use your time wisely to shore up the moral courage and conviction of those who are in a position and are often taking great risks to take a stand against the injustice. They immediately get a lot of flack from the people who don't like what they're doing. So let's make sure they get 10 times as much commendation and support from those of us who appreciate them. This also goes for things like commenting on social media threads. If someone puts a picture of their protest, the trolls will get there, right? They're going to come and say, oh, this is stupid. Make sure you get there and say, thank you for getting out and protesting. Last but not least, remember that we also have the power to non-cooperate with life as usual. Hiras don't just need their little minions all in a line. They also need everyday life to more or less go on like it should, right? Children need to go to school, parents need to go to work, church functions need to happen. We can non-comply with that. There's so many ways to disrupt what we're expected to do. Things like not going to sports events because we're too upset at the demise of our democracy. Not holding, going to Memorial Day parades because they cut the veteran affairs, right? So there are many opportunities in this. So I'm going to pause there because I think it's a really great time to get some of your questions. There are a lot of things to talk about. Thank you so
much, Rivera. Thank you. That was an incredible sort of tour de force of learning about non-cooperation. And there's so much more there, in American history, let alone in other countries, than I knew about. I want to bring Ken and Maria back onto the stage right now. And I do have some great questions from the audience. Before we go to that, Ken, I do want to ask you, I'm going to sort of ask the first question, which is, Ken, you were involved in organizing a very important non-cooperation movement called the Pledge of Resistance. And I just wonder if you could share with us briefly about what that was and what lessons you took away from that might be relevant today.
Thanks, Michelle. I learned as a baby activist that we have more power than we think. And one of the ways I learned that was being involved with some friends in organizing what essentially became the direct action arm of the U.S. Central America peace movement in the 1980s, at a time when President Reagan wanted to invade Nicaragua and wage war against the poor in El Salvador. And we organized, without the internet, way back then, 100,000 people who took a pledge to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and legal protest. We organized ourselves into 400 groups in 10 parts of this country. We had 50 groups in the Deep South. And we organized one nonviolent action after another to withdraw our consent. And I will just mention, I worked about 8 years on that campaign, and it was many other people as well, and was the national coordinator in Washington for 3 years then. But what we learned at one point, just to make the point of this webinar, is after an action where 1,000 people in San Francisco and Boston engaged in civil disobedience at a critical moment, we learned from within the Reagan administration that they had decided not to invade Nicaragua. Why? Because the American people had told them that. And instead they went underground with what later became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. But the U.S. invaded Iraq twice, Panama, Afghanistan, but never invaded Nicaragua. And that was the result of ordinary people like ourselves engaging in this. And I think that kind of commitment to nonviolent action probably is a very important step in this climate.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I'm looking now at the Q&A where participants have been submitting questions, and there are many of them, and we are not going to have time to get to all of them. But I'm gonna conflate a couple of them together and ask. Let's see. I think I'm going to ask you, Rivera, this question. There are a couple of questions here about concerns about deportation, and how can U.S. citizens, what does it mean, non-cooperation with deportation, for U.S. citizens who are not themselves the subject of deportation? And then what does it mean for the impacted people, the people who themselves are vulnerable? What would non-cooperation by these two different groups of people look like in a situation like the current one?
Yeah, we are actually seeing mass non-compliance with the attempt to round up immigrants in the migrant community. Some of the things that we are seeing include widespread Know Your Rights trainings. This has been so effective that the Borders Czar even said, they're making it very difficult to round up migrants. And you have to wonder when you hear something like that, because literally they are telling people what the law is. How can we uphold the law? And ICE is saying, well, you're stopping us from not complying with the law, from doing illegal roundups, right? So know your rights. First of all, we're also seeing particularly educators defend the historic right of kind of safe zones. So in hospitals, schools, and churches or faith centers, where traditionally ICE was not allowed and would not come in, because those are places of sanctuary and where people are vulnerable, or they're like hospitals are essential services for human rights. So in schools, we're seeing educators block the doors and not let ICE inside. We're also seeing people alert and mobilize people when ICE is around. This is a long history in the immigrant community. So on top of that, we're also now entering a new phase, a next level of concern, which people have been talking about for a long time, where we're seeing people like permanent resident Mahoud Khalil be illegally attempted to be deported and detained illegally for simply speaking up against a genocide, exercising his First Amendment right, just like we all have. So I think this is a time where we need to see tactics on the scale of the Muslim ban campaign at the airports. That things that disrupt, if we can't disrupt the deportations themselves, disrupting business or life as usual until our demand that the law be upheld and people's rights be upheld forces the administration back into compliance. And we are seeing them ignore the rule of law and the judge's orders. So this is a really important moment for a lot of entwined issues. That's just some of the examples. There are many more, but I hope that's a helpful thing for us to start thinking about.
Okay, great. Maria, this is a challenging question. I'm going to give this to you. I'm reading this. How do we navigate the distinction between the healthy and appropriate expression of religious faith and Christian nationalism? And how do we reach out to those who are living, or maybe the question remains, practicing forms of religiously motivated violence and speech and action to appeal to their conscience? I know you think a lot about religion in public life, Maria. So what would you say to that?
Oops. I mean, just to say that there are definitely organizations and networks that are very seized with the reality of Christian nationalism. And I'm thinking about Christians Against Christian Nationalism as a network and trying to work with churches and communities to offer an alternative, like, perspective on Christ's teachings, that Christian nationalism is fundamentally antithetical to the teachings of Christ. And so referring to scripture, but also organizing in ways. So bringing, like, at the community level, there are groups like the Cairo Center, for example, has been doing a lot of work around, like, basic service issues, around poverty. Because, like, often Christian nationalist groups, for example, after, the Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, you had groups that were showing up to provide basic services, mutual aid. So part of it, and wearing, t-shirts that indicated their affiliation with churches that were fundamentally Christian nationalists. And so being able to, like, offer, basic services and a welcoming home. So the mutual aid component, I think, is one part of it, showing care and concern in a real way and offering an alternative. So I think there's, like, different ways to go about it. There are pastors, there's the Russell Moores who kind of left the Southern Baptist Convention over its embrace of Christian nationalism, who are trying to, like, organize pastors and others and provide. So I think there are different attempts, but it's definitely a large challenge, and Christian nationalism is integrally intermixed with authoritarianism in the U.S. So it's hard to distinguish the two of them. So that would be my opening thoughts.
Okay. Thanks, Maria. We are almost out of time. There's one question that's come up a few times. Ken, I'm going to ask you this, although if others have something to say about it. Several people asked about non-payment of taxes as a form of non-cooperation with the government. And I think they're talking here about, individuals choosing not to pay, for example, federal taxes. And the question is this an effective form of protest? And what are the risks to people who choose to practice that form of non-cooperation?
Well, I'm actually going to ask Rivera to respond to this because Rivera has been teaching on this.
There is a long history of tax resistance, and there's some great coordinators of it. The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee is a mouthful, but it is the place to go. National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. So please look them up. They are also working on supporting people right now who feel like we are not getting our representation in our government, particularly those of us who are being literally erased from government websites. And so they're working on a campaign around tax resistance for what's going on. There can be risks and consequences. Being connected to a movement can help alleviate some of those. There are also many ways to do tax resistance, some of which are more high risk than others. Others can also be, like, fully within compliance with tax law. So again, go to the people who've been doing this for decades and please look it up.
Okay, thank you. And there have been a lot of questions from people, participants in the webinar today who, feel that they're not experienced in nonviolent methods, and they want to learn more. So I want to assure everyone we will be sharing things in the follow-up email, but really, I mean, Pace Bene as an organization is dedicated to teaching about nonviolence. So They have many courses, webinars, books, etc. You can really learn a lot. And like I said, we'll connect you to resources. I'm afraid,
Can I chime in there at the risk of
yes.
non-cooperating with our scheduled time to end? So it's an important discussion. If we go a few minutes over, I think it is a few minutes worth spent in pursuit of protecting our democracy. So people can find out more. A great clearinghouse for what is going on and who's resisting what is Choose Democracy. You'll find a lot of resources, including links to Boycott Central, the Resist List, even kind of curriculums for guiding your group in learning more about resistance. So choosedemocracy.us. And at Pace Bene, we have a special program that we're running called Rise and Shine. It's resistance time, where we are really inviting people like you to engage with the transformative power of active nonviolence for resistance, for community care, for cooperation and solidarity. You sign the simple pledge. It is painless. And we follow up by sending you more things like what we are doing today: knowledge, resources, calls to action, historic examples of how people have done this work before. This is one resource, and we'll make sure you get this in the follow-up email. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Rivera. And thank you so much. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Rivera. This has been an amazing conversation. I've enjoyed it so much. We do need to conclude, and we always conclude our events with a closing prayer. So I'd like to invite Tom Hushek to the stage. Tom is a recent pilgrim to Assisi and also a member of the DC Franciscan Justice Circle, and I've asked him to say a brief closing prayer. Tom?
I hope everyone from all religious beliefs and systems of belief can join me. Creator of all, we humbly ask you to guide the world towards peace and justice. May hearts be softened and divisions overcome as we strive for a world where all people can live in harmony and dignity. Grant wisdom and compassion to leaders. Grant strength to those who suffer from violence, conflict, poverty, or oppression. And grant courage to all those who seek peace and are striving to build a nonviolent and just world. May our actions reflect your love and compassion, and may your peace reign in our hearts and communities and throughout the world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Everyone who registered for this webinar is going to receive an email with the recording, as Rivera mentioned, with some other resources. And I really encourage you, if you're not receiving the e-newsletters from both of our organizations, from Pace Bene and Franciscan Action Network, please consider signing up if you want to be invited to more good events like this one. I also want to just mention two exciting events coming up. Registration is now open for FAN's Franciscan Justice Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C. in October 2025. And the other one, very exciting, is that Pace Bene and FAN are going to do our second Peace and Justice pilgrimage to Assisi, Italy, together in April 2026. And we will shortly be sending out all the details about that and the registration information. So I hope to see many of you at one of those events. I thank all of our speakers and all of you for attending, and I wish you peace and